Hello and welcome to Unscripted. Ally,
Hey,
how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jen?
I am fantastic today. And you know what? I just want to acknowledge quickly before we get into our topic, and I know we're going to chat about other random things too, because we are unscripted and all, is how delightful your memoir is.
Oh, thank
Like,
you.
I genuinely had such a good reading experience with your memoir. So I just wanted to comment on that because I feel like so often people read it and then you don't hear feedback, or you do sometimes you don't. But I really appreciate you, and I very much enjoyed it. So thank you.
Oh, well, thanks. And I mean, not that anybody else cares, but we have way more in common than we even knew. Like,
Mhm.
which is always so mind-boggling to me.
Mhm.
The
I know.
similarities that
I
we
know.
continue to find.
Every show we record, because I think we're on 6 months now, right? Yeah, this
Yeah.
should be 6. Yeah,
Yep.
so we're getting to our groove, which is wonderful. And then every time we end, we're like, wow, there's another commonality. Then you read the memoir, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of commonality.
There's a
But I
lot
guess
going on with
but I
with
think that's the
Allie.
cool thing, right, about authors and books, is that, one of the really cool things is that you can read a book, whether you know the person or not, and you can see yourself reflected in it. You can find your voice, and you're like, oh wow, I'm not alone in whatever any number of things could be. So
Yeah. And
that's why I
that is
love
why memoir rocks. That is why memoir is so my jam and my favorite because of the connection of like human spirit, like
it. Hmm.
basically.
Hmm.
And celebrating similarity over difference, though we also want to celebrate difference. And that being said,
Hmm.
we want to acknowledge June.
We sure
Happy
do.
Pride Month and happy Juneteenth. I don't know if happy is really the right word, but we want to acknowledge all of our folks out there that we love and respect and admire and inspire us every day. And we, celebrating with you throughout the month of June, which is a
Yeah.
perfect segue to today's topic.
And that is why we're having this topic in this month in particular, because yes, Pride Month has, for those of us who are part of the queer community, there are endless amounts of things that we can participate in, be involved in. We just actually did a private workshop for our LGBTQ plus authors on Wednesday this week, which was really cool. And our guest was also part of that workshop. So there's just never any dull moment in my experience. But at the same time, I think one of the things to always remember is that, Pride is just, it's just a celebratory month, but, queer people are all over the place all the time, the other 11 months of the year. And so, today we'll talk a little more broad about inclusivity, but certainly the LGBTQ side of things, I think, will come up in our conversation today as well with our special guest. Do we want to bring her on in?
We sure do. And while we're bringing her on in, I just want to like tag team off of what you just said. And that is that when it comes to today's topic, right? We don't want you to only think about DEI in your content just in the months where there is a celebratory focus. We want you to be thinking about it always. And so we have a special guest to help us do that. You want to introduce her, Jen?
I would love to. So, yes, we're fangirling about Jen's book. So, what's fantastic is that Jen has another book, which I didn't grab off my shelf, called Inclusive AF. And so this is the second book that she has worked on with PYP. And what I love about our topic today, which is diversity, inclusion, and representation in content creation for anyone who designs, writes, or publishes. And so this is with Dr. Jen O'Ryan. And I think there's a lot to explore here, because what we're really talking about is just making sure that our content, whether it's from a written standpoint or a design standpoint, is very intentionally designed and inclusive of everybody. And so and I'll let Jen, you kind of share your origin story of why you even wrote this book, but spoiler alert, it's because something didn't exist, or what did exist was not actually helpful. So Jen, I am so happy that we have been working together for a very long time, and thrilled to have you here as our June guest. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. I have been so looking forward to this conversation. It's that the origin of the book was exactly that. I was like most most books have a story. Ha, no pun intended. I was driving through the desert at night by myself, listening to an audiobook on murder houses and unsolved murders. as one does.
Perfect for
And
a solo
so,
drive in the desert.
yep, middle of nowhere, what could possibly go wrong? I'm literally creating the plot of my own murder story in this story. But it was an unsolved murder, and the author, who was also doing the narration, kept referring to the murder as he every time. And I realized that either they had some kind of inside information that they should share with authorities, or they were just using he as a default pronoun because that is how we've been conditioned to write. And so I was frustrated that there were no style guides on writing about representing humans, writing about gender, writing about representing all the different ways of being. And so I wrote one. So think elements of style, but instead of comma splices and when to semicolon, it's about avoiding bias, stereotypes, appropriation, ableism, all of the things, and not just how to avoid that, but how to really bring to life all these different ways of the human experience.
So well said.
I want to chime in though and just talk about how funny it seems to me that serial killers is what got you there. Like how serial killers made me think about inclusivity in writing. Like, I mean, like there's
It's
a
a great
whole
blog topic.
yeah, totally. Like, please write that and see what happens, because I feel like people are going to be like, "Come what now? Like what? What? Like what'd she say?" So yeah, I love that. That's the opening story. Like that's how the book has become a part of our world.
So
Wonderful.
good. You know, how I think this conversation will best go is that I'm curious, Ally, because I know that you have the book, you read the book. Jen and I obviously worked on the book together, so I feel like I have a very different lens in which I'm looking at it through. But because you are someone who does produce content for others, as well as obviously yourself in business and things like that, I'm curious, you know, like what your line of questioning to start us with would kind of go, because I can only imagine the directions this conversation we could take.
Oh my gosh, where to even begin? Well, the thing that rises to the top for me is that I have some clients who specifically focus, let's say, on working with women. Like their identified avatar is working with women. But then when we start talking about leadership, you know, is it women in leadership? Is it female leadership? The differences between women and female, but then also wanting to reach a non-binary audience who wouldn't identify as women, and this kind of interesting way of trying to shape the writing, knowing that she is targeting a particular audience, yet at the same time wanting to be inclusive of a wider audience. And we're constantly trying to figure out, well, what is it? Like, you know, it's not wrong for her to have decided that, you know, it's women focused. At the same time, though, how do you make your language more inclusive if you're not just open to people who identify as women? I don't know. It feels like this conundrum to be clear in the messaging while also being inclusive and paying attention to what they're trying to strive for and what their results are, and then how to coach or guide, right, on how one does that effectively.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say that, and that is such a common situation, wanting to support a segment of the population, but not limiting to that population, like not to the exclusion of others. And that's where, for me, it comes down to that being really precise and refining what the intention is. So I work with an organization, and it's women business owners, and they are women business owners, but they're also leaders. And you can be a leader without necessarily owning a business. And so it's situations like that where it really just comes down to what are the other messages that are being conveyed outside of the title and the avatar, because that's where we pick up a lot of our cues. If we feel like we would be represented or welcome there. One thing that I have found, though, is especially in the non-binary, transgender, gender fluid, genderqueer community, is that if you say all women, that tends to be a signaling that all women are welcome. Again, that's a generalization, but yeah, there are subtle cues that you can build into it so that people recognize that they would be welcome there.
But if we say all women, is that not then just replacing this idea that to use he or man when not knowing gender labels? Is that doing the same thing but in reverse?
Well, but again, it goes back to what are the other elements that are in that message. So take it, for example, a web page. It wouldn't just be the headline is all women are welcome. There would also be images that are used. There would be certain language that would be used. And that's where you kind of weave in this undertone of we welcome all humans.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's more about inclusivity in totality. But I think in books it might be, well, I guess books, you have the context of what's coming before it and what's coming after the usage of whatever term or phrase. But a lot of times there's no imagery that accompanies that. But maybe there is on the book cover that somehow illuminates, or maybe there's some, I don't know, something in their marketing, I would imagine.
Yeah, because it's really targeted towards how humans make meaning, right? So we tend to look for symbols and images and things like that are easier to process. And then we tie in words to substantiate that meaning. And then, that's how we kind of put together what we're interpreting in the words and images in combination. And so it is sometimes necessary to be subtle about inclusivity because it's the world that we're in now. We don't want to create a target under the guise of trying to support somebody.
So the subtitle of your book is A Style Guide for Humanizing Your Content, which I think is a great, and we have obviously had conversations about this. Like, I think it's a great subtlety to it because you're not calling it out under some larger DEIB, whatever other umbrella, right? You're very intentional that it's really about just humanizing content and making anyone feel connected to whatever's being said. Because it really, I don't think, in your case, listening to the murder podcast, like that's something that's just kind of irritating. And I don't think it matters what your personal sexual orientation is. Like that's kind of irrelevant, or what your race is, that's irrelevant. It's just more of like, that just doesn't, it's not sitting right with me. And I would imagine there's probably a lot of people who might hear something like that, who also might have that like, it's not really just, it's not jiving with me. But what my question, or what I'm curious about is, there's a backlash as, Jen, I feel like at least you and I have been seeing in the DEI space, where there's just this sweeping movement to downplay, to remove DEI initiatives in companies or in municipalities or states across, there's a lot of kind of stuff happening. So how does one, because to me, your book it's not a DEI book, right? Yeah. Like, and I feel like I want to make that clear. So like if somebody, like, my question at the end of the day is the business case. So if somebody is responsible for creating content, whether it's in a book or whether it's on a website or they're a copywriter or whatever it is, what is the business case for them to pay attention to content like this that is completely irrelevant to the DEIB conversation?
It's so yes, and going back to the humanizing content. So this book does go far beyond what we typically think of as DEIB, the differences between the D and the E and the I and the B and representation, like all of those words have a very different meaning and a very different application. And one of the reasons that I went with humanizing your content is because so much content out there, like textbooks, websites, onboarding for employees, employee training, things like that, they're not created in a way that humans can easily process them. They're either Times New Roman, very text dense, overwhelming, and not everybody processes information the same way. And so what the guys of the book is, yes, be mindful and precise about your word choice, but also give people's brains a rest. Like, actually, how do you put together your message in a way that people can read and internalize and process without, becoming overwhelmed or having competing visual points? But yeah, it really is about opening it up and making it welcoming across a broad audience. This is not, cancel culture, woke, all the things that have really been weaponized. It really is about, instead of optimizing everything into oblivion for, get through it as fast as you possibly can, really making it that human connection, making it consumable for humans, and really understanding who is being represented and how. Like if we're going back to the murder house person pronoun, yes, at the very top level, it's a grammatical hic, right? It's just a hiccup. It's a default word. But if you peel that back, it's based on erasing everybody else who isn't male. And once you start looking at your word choice through that lens, you start to notice all the absences. If you've got ableist words or images, you start to see that those are the only individuals who are represented. And so if you don't look like those people, you're not there. You're literally being erased. And that level of human connection is the underpinning.
I mean, it seems like so I'm thinking about this business case, thing. Like, so looking at this book as like a tool, right, for business owners, regardless of their models, entrepreneurs, corporate, nonprofit, whatever, right? It's creating an experience for which any of your people, if we're looking at it from like that onboarding perspective, that was one of the things I found the most fascinating, was not thinking about all of this public facing marketing stuff, right, that sells you as the company or the business, but like the internal culture climate that you're creating, right, with the people who are meant to go out and sell and promote. And I would think that this, the thing that people should be paying attention to, right, is like, yeah, it's one thing to be diverse and inclusive outwardly, because like public image and all these things, but at the end of the day, the people who are going to sell your company or sell your business are engaged, satisfied, happy, and valued employees. Mm-hmm. And if they're not seen within the materials that you are creating, especially during hiring and onboarding, when mm-hmm. they're just beginning their employee journey, right? Like, what does that really mean for your business at the end of the day if you haven't taken care of your own people?
Exactly. You aren't treating them as humans, and you're not connecting with them as humans. And it's kind of like that drip. It's like, the drip that eventually erodes into the Grand Canyon, which my metaphor is falling apart, but you get where I'm going. But no, and it's actually funny. I don't have, oh, I do. No, I don't. Okay. I had an early reader say that it will change how you see language and images. And then they scratched out see and said experience, because not everybody sees language and images. So it's just that subtle shift. But no, I was actually helping a client earlier this year smooth out their onboarding process, and the whole engagement, the candidate, the interview cycle, everything was very human focused and very personalized to that individual. And then there was this hard cut where they're signing the offer letter, they're signing the agreement, they're getting the handbook and the guide and everything. And all of that was very legal, heavy technical jargon. They were talking about in the offer letter, talking about what happened if they were terminated, that they could be fired at any time. And I'm like, wait. How about just congratulations? How about, like, why are we talking about what happens if they get fired in the offer letter? Like, yes, you have to have that somewhere, I'm sure, from a legal perspective. But if I'm reading this, I'm like, I have made a terrible mistake and I'm not signing it. Like, I'm going to go work somewhere else. And they had just never really thought about it that way or read the document. They got it off of some, legal website, and they just have been using it. And so we, tweaked out a little bit, and, it's difficult to measure the precise impact of just those elements, but I can't imagine that there would be a non-positive response.
Yeah.
Like, especially congratulations, we're so glad you're here. If you get fired, this is what's going to happen. And I just like that, too much of a head twist.
I would imagine too that there's something to be said for, well, we've been doing it this way, and I'm sure this extends to a lot more than just, contracts and offer letters and things like that, right? So we can talk about this a little bit more broadly, but we've been doing it this way forever, and it seems to have worked. So why would we change it? And I think that this goes back to, it's earlier on in the book, but you talk about the save symbol, the floppy disk, and then of course the bathroom signs, right? And you very eloquently point out that these are old symbols. Like these are old symbols from an older way of seeing and doing things, like seeing as in cultural beliefs and norms and things like that. So why wouldn't we update to catch up with like where we are now?
Yeah, it is. It just becomes normal. It just becomes what we expect to see. Yeah. And nobody questions it. But at the end of the day, does it really work for everybody? Or does it work for the people who were setting that up?
So like what would be a tactical, like let's put some action around some things then when we think about like these materials and content, and we're thinking about not falling into the trap of, well, it's worked for the last 3 years, 5 years, and so I haven't touched it because it seems to be working. Like what would be your suggestions and recommendations?
That is where I like to apply this end-to-end design level thinking, where you are actually going through the experience and really evaluating, what am I trying to convey here? So we'll take word choice and precision. What are we really trying to convey? And are we just using these default words? Because we have a tendency to kind of pick words up when we're in about the 8th grade, and we just keep using them. They just keep working for us. And they work for us, but we don't really think about how they're being received and how we could use a different word to describe, or a different expression. We have this amazing capacity for vocabulary, excuse me, that we just really don't tap into. And so I am a huge fan of find it and fix it. Go through the system, ask yourself, how might you experience this as somebody who is not me, somebody who has a different lived experience, has different abilities, has different limitations, and find those bumps, find those little hiccups in the system, and then fix it. And it's a huge oversimplification, but oftentimes if you go through, a registration form, or, signing up for an event, or registering for a hotel room, it's those little things along the way that kind of exclude.
I feel like some people would have that skill set to be able to identify it and then also know how to take the proper actions to fix it. But I would imagine there's probably others that no matter how many times they look at something, they're like, this is fine. Like, this is the way we've been doing it. This looks perfectly fine to me. Would you recommend to somebody, number one, they can hire someone like yourself. So that's like an easy win. But is there something that, is there a recommendation for them to say, all right, if you can't identify the problem, grab somebody who can, ask your most recent customer, ask your most recent hire, or whoever it might be. Would that be a good kind of like starting point for someone who might have the desire, but just doesn't really have the skill set to kind of identify the problems?
Yeah. And that's a really great point. And that's one of the reasons why, we're such fans of diversity, because we need all these diverse perspectives to be in the room making those decisions. And it's also not, and this is also the painful part from the business perspective, is it's never really done. And so as people start to uncover some of these exclusionary things, they will discover more exclusionary things. Our understanding of the world is constantly changing. And so there's definitely an element of that continuous improvement applied to that. But yeah, the other difficulty in that business case that you described is, even if the person is close enough to it and able to identify the problems, they might not be able to influence the decision makers, the people who have to either resource the change or make the change or absorb the change. And so it's building that element of innovation should be already part of the business. If your company is going to be agile and responsive to market shifts, you have to look for things that your customers hate. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, companies like Amazon and Microsoft have their customer call centers, and they will actually review what people are complaining about with their products and experiences. And that is an amazing way to get a collection of, a range of diverse perspectives of what's not working. But yeah, it's it's a matter of asking your customers, asking who you can, and then just continually evaluating.
It's kind of like having beta readers for a book.
Exactly. You're not going to catch everything. Like, I'm still finding typos in my book after having, gone through so many proofreading and that kind of thing. You're not going to catch everything, but you can work through it. You can get to the big stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like too, though, it's also acknowledging that you don't know what you don't know, and acknowledging that depending on your experience, identity, lens, you might not be able to find the things that are glaringly obvious. Like, I think about like people who are in the, dominant culture, right? Might not know what to be even looking for because they're used to being in the dominant culture. So like they take that for granted, right? And they can't see the things that could be impacting, that could be those, micro or macro aggressions through their content because they don't have any other lens, right? And then of course, having to then figure out, could they comfortably say, if they're conscious enough, could they say to somebody, I need help with this because I don't know how to see it, right? Figure it out, right? Or are they just not conscious enough and they just think the rest of us are all belly aching, to be too inclusive and all the whining, right? People do. So, man, like a really specific checklist of things to like look for would be really great. Like, on my registration forms or on my onboarding forms, am I asking for a limited scope of pronouns or gender identity use? On my images on my website, am I representing a diverse body of people in, body type, color of skin, whatever? Am I identifying that my values are X, on my site? Have I checked my, word choice for more inclusive language? Like, these are just things that are like drifting to the top of my head. I have enough awareness to check for those things. And I'm also always trying to learn more, right? But like, not everybody is starting where I'm starting from. So, how do we make it simple for people to buy in, I guess, is where I'm going with this.
Yeah, and it's so I came up in tech. Spent most of my adult career in tech, and so for me, it's looking at it like, well, how do you do your quality checks before you release something? Like,
Yeah.
what are you looking for? Very similar to that, because it is, it's a design flaw, it's a defect, and so yeah, I mean, I would start with what is the off the shelf content that you all. Let me take a step back. All the points at which there is human interaction, that is where the possibility for either, visually excluding or word choice or something like that being exclusionary. And so that's where I would start. And that's where I recommend in the book starting is, do you have a registration experience? Do you have an onboarding process? Do you have an offboarding process? Like, what are your norms within the group? Like, who is being left out? Who's being represented? Like, it's the social norms and the interactions at the starting of meetings, for example, can be a really good place to evaluate how am I talking about this? Who is being represented?
Yeah.
And it is really industry specific, but the thing is that a lot of that can be reused across industry. Where it becomes really specific is like, okay, well, do you have a web interface? Do you have, is everybody working on a manufacturing floor? Like, that's where the nuance comes in. But yeah, even event planning. I mean, if you're going through planning an event, what is the history of the venue? Does it have a history of racism or exclusionary? Are the tables far enough apart that people who might have mobility issues or different body size will be able to comfortably navigate? Is there a quiet room for introverts? Is there, is it overwhelming with strobe lights? I don't know what kind of event you're having. Maybe you have strobe lights. And just really being cognizant of people who process information differently, people who process sounds and lights differently.
Yeah, those are great examples.
And don't book your events in places that have systemic racism.
That's helpful.
So we're obviously in the business of writing and publishing books. So I mean, let's drill this down a little bit further, right? I'm sure people are coming to this particular conversation from a variety of lenses and maybe not thinking about books and publishing exactly, but our promise through Unscripted is to give dish, deets, dish, dirt, and deets. Man, that was a mouthful. I've got it right every other time, but today on writing and publishing, you know, where should we as authors, cover designers, typesetters, you know, where should we be focusing our attention when it comes to, you know, being more inclusive in this kind of content creation space that we're in?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because there are, if you know, you don't, unless you've gone through the process of writing a book, you don't ever appreciate, I think, how much goes into it. All these little details, all these decisions that need to be made. I tend to focus more on the nonfiction space, but that perfect example is if you are citing sources in, say, an economics book. If all of the sources that you're citing are white men from the US and Canada, expand that base, expand it, because there are other people doing other bodies of work that need to be represented and need to have their voices and their thoughts out there. Just evaluating really, how are you representing humans? Avoid formulas. Don't try and, you know, come up with a percentage of whatever is being represented, but really understand that it should naturally reflect the world.
You know, it's interesting about the sources. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. I always think about reviews and testimonials and things like that, and always making sure that there's a diversity of people who are providing those, and diversity both kind of in the context where we're talking about it, but also even like job title or industry, or just like really being mindful of tapping into all of that. And I've had people come back and say, well, someone's not going to know the race or gender or age or whatever of the person, you know, just by seeing their name. I'm like, it doesn't matter, because people in those communities might recognize that name, and that's what matters. So it's not, you're not doing it to check a box to say, hey, I tokenized all these people by being diverse. It's more of a different people are going to resonate with different people because they might know that person or source. So I like that you're kind of bringing into citations too. It's a really great.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, the tokenization is a real thing that people need to be cognizant of, because it's almost like, if you think of like an 80s sitcom, right? Is this person only in the book to serve a purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Are they just the neighbor who pops in, or are they the weird kid who lives next door? Which I guess would also be a neighbor. But it's, are they there to serve a purpose? And if they are, then you really need to take a long look and see how you can change that.
Yeah, you don't want people to look or feel tokenized, because I feel like that's, to me, that's kind of like the good intentions behind it, but it's executed poorly, because it might be like, hey, I want to be inclusive of everybody. I happen to know a person who checks this box. Let me grab them, without the consideration of, let's expand that diversity. Just adding one diverse voice into what you're doing is not going to be sufficient enough, and it will make that person feel alienated.
Exactly. Appropriation. Appropriation is another big thing in cover design, and you know, being sprinkled in throughout the content of the book. It's really difficult for people to separate, like, why can't I use a dream catcher or a totem pole in this reference? And it's like, well, if you're doing it in a way that honors the tribe that created it, that's one thing. If you're doing it because you think it looks cool hanging out the rearview mirror, that's another conversation we should have.
I definitely.
What about, what's an example of cover? Is that what you mean by cover design? Like using the images of those things in cover design?
Yes. Without really acknowledging why, you know, the meaning behind it and who created it and why it's sacred in many cases.
Yeah. So one of the other things I was thinking about, you were talking about sources, but also like if you're using examples. So you're using a case study, you could think about how your case study can be more diverse. If you have a wide client base, right, then share case studies that, you know, kind of cover a variety and diversity of your client base not just all the case studies that represent one particular type of, client, or you're using a celebrity example or book titles and other authors, right? You can diversify who you're including in your list of examples of celebrity references or whatever, to acknowledge that you're also thinking more broadly, of that material. And actually, just with another client recently, we were including statistics on something, a concept she was dealing with in the manuscript. And, when we stepped away and we had a beta reader look at it, they were like, hey, these stats are great, but we're missing any stats that are specific to BIPOC women. Mm-hmm. And we were like, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for showing us that we had a blind spot here, that we missed this, and that we can do better in this particular area, right, of the manuscript. So I think there's a lot of ways to be thinking about the content, especially in that nonfiction instance. And I love what you brought up about covers. I was thinking not just with images, but maybe there's color types, for visually impaired. That maybe it's not that they can't see it at all, but that different tones or hues or those types of things could be considered in the design of the cover to reach a wider audience. I mean, these are things that I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that there's science around, color technology and that kind of thing.
It's the same thing with fonts. So there's certain fonts that are better for someone who's dyslexic to be able to read, for example. And so we have a number of books that are using really specific font types for that purpose. So yeah, and I think that it's just, and again, under the lens of books, I think when you're working with the right people, it'll help you see your own areas where you're kind of missing something potentially. So I think that's, and Ally, you and I are always talking about teams, right? Publishing is a team sport, writing is a team sport, and really making sure that you have the right people around you to kind of help you avoid these pitfalls, because the last thing you want to do, and I definitely actually saw a book the other day that had the worst color clashing situation happening on it. And it was traditionally published on top of it. So I was actually surprised, because I feel like you expect that from a self-published book, but not from one of the big ones. And I'm like, somebody with any type of visual impairment is absolutely not going to be able to read this, because my sight is fine, and I was having some severe issues with it. And it's it just means that someone they didn't go the extra step to ask people to just do that, kind of take the time. And I know people are rushing, especially when it gets to publishing, because you've been working on the writing for so long that once you get to the publishing phase, you're like, I need to have this done yesterday. And it's let's slow down a little bit. We need at least 6 months to kind of make this right. But when you add in that step of asking, like you were saying, Ally, asking for someone's feedback on something, it's just going to make it stronger, and it will be worth the 6 or 8 weeks that it might add to your timeline. It really is worth it to slow down and be inclusive, because you might be pissing off people in all directions and not even realize it, because no one's going to be the one that tells you what you're doing wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I one of my good friends used to work at Disneyland, and they don't point because that's impolite. So they gesture with their hands, and it's that small little adjustment, like you said, that you have no idea how many people you're turning off. You have no idea how many people are getting halfway through your book and then just putting it down because they're just tired of being offended or being erased. The other thing, though, and again, this is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to me in the book creation and publishing world, because it's not a linear process, right? You don't sit down in front of your computer and start typing chapter 1 in the beginning, blah, blah, blah. It moves, it shifts. Things that were in this chapter, ended up being in a completely different section or deleted altogether. And in that moment, I don't have the objectivity to stand back and see, oh, wait, I used this example here, and I also used this example here. That's what the early readers help with. It's the same thing. We are not going to be able to spot the occurrences and the patterns of bias or exclusion because we're just way too close to the work.
I think that brings up something really important too when it comes to those early readers, especially if you are trying to tackle a topic that's about diversity and inclusivity, right? Making sure that there are other eyes on it, hopefully diverse ones, that can help to make sure that you're getting to the point that you want to make without doing any harm, right?
Yes.
because again, and so Jen just read my memoir. I have a whole chapter in there about dealing with some racism that happened on the schoolyard as an elementary student, and I failed poorly in confronting this other girl in her remarks and sticking up for another girl who the remarks were geared towards. And when I was writing that chapter, I had all kinds of anxiety about that particular chapter. Was I saying exactly what I wanted to say? Was I saying it in a way that people were understanding what I was meaning? You know, was I doing more harm to people of color who might read this chapter when I'm trying to talk about something from the lens of somebody who witnessed and did a poor job of advocating and being an ally? You know, this was a chapter that kept me up, and this was a chapter that I was constantly nitpicking at because I was like, I don't think I got it right, and I got to tweak it again, you know. But the early readers were critical in helping me to identify ways to shift it, change it, make it a little bit better, or validating that they understood what I said and that like they got it, and it was all good. But it took that extra due diligence as well as the awareness, right? So this goes back to being aware, getting some help. But it took that extra due diligence and those outside perspectives to look at it, right? Because I couldn't see it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I also couldn't see what I didn't know. And there might have been things that I didn't know. So early readers for the win.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And that's the thing. That's what is so important to this, is being, you know, not only self-aware that we're going to screw it up. I screw things up all the time. We're just going to. You do not undo 50 some years of being ingrained overnight just because you want to. But it is also being very transparent in the fact that we are not always going to get it right. We don't know everything. We can try, and we can be aware, and we can be open to feedback, but it's going to get missed. It would be like me trying to cut the back of my hair. I can't see it.
Yeah,
it would be a huge mistake. So, no, but that's, and can I share a story? Okay, this is, I'm gonna be real. So the style guide itself is 2-3 chapters. I almost didn't put in a section on capitalization, when to capitalize black, white. I almost did. And I actually included that in the book because same, Ally, it kept me up. I'm like, I have feelings and opinions, and I have an approach for capitalization. But this book wasn't about here's what I do because I'm so smart. No, it's here's what the research shows. Here's best practice. Here's things to consider. And I ended up putting it in because it's important. And the fact that it was making me that uncomfortable, to me, signaled that it was even more important that it be in there. And so what I did is I cited multiple organizations, the APA, AMA, things like that, and said, this is what they do, and here's why. Because the other side of that is, if you're writing about research, you have to use the words that the researcher used. You can't just change it because our understanding's changed. And so there are different situations where this would be a better approach than this, and then hope the reader has enough context with the rest of the material that it actually is congruent. It has integrity. But that, yeah, I mean, it's the uncomfortable that means we're heading in the right direction.
I think that is such a great example, both of you, right? Because you're both talking about having the awareness and dealing with the uncomfort and finding the right resources to make sure that you're doing it appropriately. And I think, Jen, this ties into, again, thinking about books and publishing, is style sheets, right? Like, this is a style guide for humanizing your content, but every publisher has their own style guide. And every book has their own style sheet within the style guide. And I feel like, and you and I have brainstormed and talked about this before, but I think your, like, a big opportunity is providing this lens to publishers' style guides to make sure that things are appropriately talked about and handled. And we have absolutely more times than I can count, because we do have a lot of books that are diversity, equity, and inclusion focused. And we've had the debate round and round over whether white is capitalized in a number of different books. And so it is now just part of our our style guide, but then there's another layer of consideration to take when you're actually working on a specific manuscript, and then you have the style sheet that goes along with it. So I think it's one of those things that, like, we have a whole section in our style guide that talks about a lot of this stuff, and it's kind of sprinkled in different sections. So it's not like, oh, hey, here's how to be inclusive section of the style guide. The whole style guide is about how to make sure that we're doing right by the English language, as well as being inclusive and making sure that it's humanized to your subtitle, Jen. So I feel like Ally, I'm curious on your side as someone who is a ghostwriter, in terms of like what style guides or style sheets or things like that you may be using, and if you see any opportunity for other people who are writing books for others to be able to kind of be intentional in their inclusion of this information too.
I mean, a lot of the time when I'm getting tapped as a ghostwriter, I'm getting tapped when that client already has a publisher on the hook or somebody that they're already working with. So a lot of the time it comes down to what's the agreement with the publisher and what are they saying are the guides. In the manuscript development, I'll be looking out for like, hey, we could do something else with, these examples, for example, like, hey, you quote, you noted 4 different old white guys. Can we broaden this a little? Can we change this up? Can we think about some other people that we might get in here? It's trying to look for the things like, okay, we've got a lot of statistics about one thing, we're missing this other. And obviously sometimes I have blind spots, right? I need somebody else to help check me. But, as I'm working on a manuscript in that ghostwriting capacity, I am thinking about some of those things as I go. But when it comes down to style guide or formatting or value or whatever, values, it's kind of like, well, what is the publisher giving you as the contractual agreement? Like, what are they working towards? Do they have that in place? And then also working with the author, like, what about your values? How do you want to make sure your manuscript comes across? What should we be looking for as we're developing this thing to ensure that we're meeting your own vision? Because, just because a publisher might not have a guide that's focusing on inclusivity, right, doesn't mean that the author isn't. So, there's a lot of different things to kind of check against. Also depends on topic, of course, right? Like, what is the topic and how do we address that topic in a way that is inclusive? So yeah, I mean, I think it should be a standard that every publishing company have, these as a part of their style guide, whatever they may be. I want to acknowledge we've got some people in the comments who are joining us live. I can't see how many people, but I know that there are at least a couple who posted. So I'm just taking a moment to acknowledge that there are folks here. Thank you for joining us. If you have something specific that you'd like us to address in these last few minutes of the show, please drop them in there for us to noodle on together. But like, let's say Dr. Jenn put together that style guide. I'd be eating that up all day long, and not just for like manuscript development. Obviously I'm going to be referring to this all the time, but if there was like one of those, like, how they do the Chicago manual style quick sheets.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Oh, yes.
Like, if you had one of these, I like, that would be within reach every time I created anything. I think the other thing that's important here to note is that we've talked about beta readers, we've talked about awareness, we've talked about, thinking more broadly, checking ourselves. And I just want to note that that's just as true, even when we're putting out the piece of short content, even when we're putting out the blog post, even when we're putting out the author landing page for the first time. Whatever it is, even short content can pack a punch, or like not in a good way. So even though the book manuscript is a much longer body of work, which we really need to be paying attention to, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that shorter material in, extension of that or adjacent to that piece of work is just as important to be following all of these things that we've, talked about today.
Ally, I love that you brought up the idea of having a guide like that. Jen, I'm sure you're already like, I know exactly how I'm going to create that. But the book itself is also designed intentionally accessible. So it's not a big 400-page book about and lecturing people on what they're doing wrong. It is very succinct, and it was designed that way on purpose. So it's like 122 pages. So point being, it can be, and I love your idea, Ally, because I think having like that just quick on your desk, that's amazing. And also being able to just kind of pick up a book that's small, and even the paragraph spacing is designed with a little extra breathability room in it. So, and I think that's something that not enough people think about in terms of the production and design of books either, is there's all of these different things, not just the words, but how things are formatted, what fonts are chosen, and all that it all comes together as one big, beautiful book baby at the end.
I do love the idea of having a laminate, though. I lived by those in my undergrad. I'm sure I still have them around here somewhere, but yeah, because you just want to pick something up and glance. And that's one of the reasons why I created this it's really a choose your own adventure, because I wanted this to be something that people could use when they're working on a specific issue. They have a specific question. They just want a quick reference. They can turn to that page and get what they need. But the rest of it is, here's how you overcome that anxiety, the visceral reaction that people can have when they realize, why do I have to change? Why do I have to think about one more thing? I don't want to change anything. I want to just live my life. And here's, sections on why that's okay. I'm not here to change anybody's belief systems. This is about giving you something to consider in your work. And so it really is, it's got things about overcoming resistance in yourself, influencing change in your organization with your publisher, just the full thing. And if you just want the quick guide, it's in there too. But I do like the idea of a laminate. We're gonna have to do that.
I want to add Pamela's comment on here. Sorry, Jen, it covers half of your face. But I think I love what Pamela says here. Awareness does create uncomfortableness in everyone. Everyone does not know everything about everyone. Your experiences are yours and mine are different than yours. However, a person of color, a woman of color, a person with a handy accessible need has lived uncomfortably all their life. So acknowledging your uncomfortableness is important. I think that's just really well said, because I think that so often, especially for those folks who are operating in the majority in some way, the second there's a moment of uncomfortableness, not everyone knows how to handle that. And so just kind of like leaning into it. Yeah, like you're uncomfortable, you run and you're like, I'm not going to do anything at all. And kind of like your point, Ally, with, figuring out how to write about it in your book specifically. And I think the way that you wrote it was very well done. And I wouldn't expect anything different from you. But I think that was just kind of easily, you could have been like, I'm just not going to include this whole chapter and just, I'm going to find a different story to tell instead. So I think just leaning into the uncomfort, which is not fun for anybody for any reason. But to Pamela's point, like there are plenty of people who just are constantly in that place. So I think we can lean into it every now and then and learn from it.
Well, we need to, or nothing will change. Like, like we have to get uncomfortable in order to change a system or, start a revolution.
Like, or finish one.
Whatever it may be, small things, big things. But, discomfort is growth. And that's the name of the game, right? The other thing I was thinking about with the quick laminated style guide, right? If I'm constantly referring to that and I'm constantly checking things like color, hashtags, emojis, am I using enough white space so that it's a little bit more scannable, easier on the eyes? Am I checking word choice for, gender representation, heteronormativity, bias, maybe phrases that are rooted in racism or discrimination that I don't even know that the phrase is tied to something, because I know the phrase and I don't know where it came from. I would think that the more times I go and I'm checking that reference, the more ingrained it's going to be to just be more attuned going forward, right, to what I'm writing or creating every time thereafter, because I build up the muscle and the habit of now looking for those things, right? And I feel like that's where we want people to go. We want them to go from a state of like complete kind of just typing things up and sending them out into the world to taking a moment of pause, right? And like really consciously being aware of what they're putting out there. and having it be a muscle, having the new normal be that we're always checking for those things.
Yep, exactly. It's and understanding it's not a fixed state.
Yeah,
it's going to continue to evolve and continue to change. No, and on your expression, I still have to have conversations with people about why you don't use the phrase drink or don't drink the Kool-Aid. Like it's still, and there's so much of it is just steeped in a horrible origin story that most people wouldn't want associated with a marketing plan. So, yeah.
I think that my takeaway as we're kind of like easing to our conclusion is I think the more we can just start to have this in our awareness, the less overwhelming it will eventually be. Because I think for Jen, like this is just kind of part of your DNA. It's certainly part of my DNA to just be, I do not know all the things, but I'm curious enough when I see something to go seek out more information about the thing. And so I think that the more you can just start to ease into it and say like, all right, I learned this today. I'm just going to take that and file it away and just make sure I don't perpetuate that thing again. Now I'm going to look at this other thing and really just kind of slowly ease into it. I think that can be a value add versus trying to consume everything at once right now, which would be very overwhelming, or just turning a complete eye to it and be like, nope, I'm not going to do any of it. I think either of those extremes are not helpful. So I think, for anyone watching where they're like, I want to dip my toe into the pond. I don't know how yet. Jen, your book is the first stopping point, in my opinion. And then just starting to proactively just do one better decision a day, I think is, how to consider, or one project, like on your next project, how do I be a little bit more intentional about this and just keep moving? Because then as new things come and, even DEIB, like that may not even be the right acronym right now. Like the acronyms are changing all the time. And even people in the industry can't keep up with it. So if you're struggling, you're not alone. I think I just kind of like just acknowledge that, like, we see you, we acknowledge that you're trying to do better. And also it is not an easy task. So just do the best that you can and, try to minimize the amount of harm being caused to others versus just being so black and white about it.
Yeah. And I think too, right, the more that you tune in to books or shows, whatever medium works for you, right, that you can consume and digest, the more that you tune in, the more that you're going to see where things are happening, right? Like I bet there are people who heard Dr. Jenn talking about, the serial killer and the podcast, right? And the fact that they kept referring to the serial killer as he. And I wish there's some people who are like, oh my gosh, I never would have even thought of that. I never would have tuned into the fact that they were always using the he pronoun, in reference to, and just little things that stick with us that then have us kind of perk up to something where now we can't unsee it, right? Or unknow it, gives us a chance to like at least be aware of that one thing. And like, that's where we start to chip away and get to a new level, a new awareness. Awareness. That's the theme of today.
That.
Yeah. Oh, this was such a good conversation. Thank you, Jen, for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I love this.
We can all nerd out.
I could geek out on language and data all day long.
Yeah, you're in good company with the two of us, I think, on the show. I think we're both like to nerd out on books. All right, let's do a little shameless self-promotion, shall we, as we wrap up?
Do it. All right. I know it's already almost, it's about to be 2. Can you believe it? It was like poof, just done.
I know, it is wild. We've been promoting Jen's book. Anything else on your side, Jen, that you would like to mention?
Actually, the book is out. If anyone's curious about my work or learning more about me, it's at pagingdrjen.com.
Love it. Amazing.
Paging Dr. Jenn.
Which is on, by the way, your business card, your the Find It and Fix It, the Paging Dr. Jenn. But before you were talking about that quote, and I found.
Yes.
I found what you were looking for. Ally, what about you?
So I'm just going to promote the Memoir Blueprint. So this is a 3-month hybrid coaching program to help people build the foundation for their memoir. You walk away with a customized business plan essentially for your book, with an understanding of who it's for, why it's relevant, what you're going to do with it, and the story you're trying to tell. And we're going to kick off that cohort in August. So if people are interested in learning more about that program, I would love for them to hit me up in a private message or a comment, and I'll get to you and give you some information about that.
Love it. Beautiful. And I'm shamelessly sharing our Getting Started for Authors Writing program, which the next one starts on September 17th. So I'm trying to get ahead of it, the promotion. So we only have 6 people in it, and it's designed to help you write your manuscript in 6 months, but also understand the intricacies and the nuances of the publishing process. So that way, when you're kind of exiting that 6 months, you're like really know how to work with a publisher and get your message out into the world. So it's available on our website. I'm accessible. Send me a message. Everything works easily there.
So I want to just thank the people who joined us today in the comments and live. We can't always see all of you, but we appreciate that you show up for these conversations. Especially you, Pamela. Thanks for being here. Thanks for weighing in as we've discussed this really wonderful topic. And we just want to give everybody a heads up that we are back again in July on the 18th for another fabulous installment of Unscripted with Ally and Jenn. So we're going to see you again in another month.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ally. Thank you, Jenn.
Thank
See you
you.
both